Good Friday afternoon to you, class. This is Instructor Bings, and we are going to go through Chapter 6. So let me get right to the slides. And these slides are going to be fairly close to the chapter layout. So if you will read your chapter and outline it yourself, you'll see that this outline, these slides follow it very closely. And hopefully I will cover stuff that we watched Craig present on Wednesday, but he was talking much too fast. So Chapter 6, Public Opinion, excuse me, Public Opinion and Political Socialization. Public opinion basically are those views that are held by ordinary citizens in which they express openly. So we're going to start there. And here you can see another aspect of the definition: public attitudes toward politics and one's role within the political system. Political socialization is how individuals, actually, I just said political culture. That was not the same as public opinion. I apologize. Public opinion is simply the views expressed by ordinary citizens that are openly conveyed. So political culture basically are, as you can see, they're public attitudes toward politics and their role within the political system. Many people, and this has been going on for a couple of decades now, as election campaigning starts to ramp up a good year and a half in advance, people are their attitude towards public politics are not good. They're so tired of hearing about it. But anyway, political socialization is how individuals form their political attitudes. That includes the factors in their lives that have contributed to their political attitudes. Things like your family, which is the most important factor. Your religious upbringing, whether you went to church or not. Your peer group, all of those things. These are the factors or the agents that help to form one's political attitude. So we'll get into all those things here. So back to public opinion. We want to discuss how public opinion is measured today in our society. And the main way that we hear about, and we discussed briefly on Wednesday, was public opinion polls. Public opinion polls. And this is the method of interviewing or giving a questionnaire to a small sample of people in hopes that it will be a fairly accurate representation of a larger population. Usually, at least 1,000 people will be in a poll to a couple of thousand. And how can they guarantee that this small sample will be an accurate representation of the large population right here? Because if you have samples that are biased, then the results are going to be false as far as representing all of the population. We talked about if you were to poll, let's say, 2,000 people living in the New York City area. Well, I better not go to New York City because New York City has a diverse population in terms of ethnicities. Many people have come to live there, religion. So let's go, let's just say East Coast. 2,000 people are interviewed. And if you do the polling on something like, what's your views on abortion, your views on same-sex marriage, your views on, let's say, legalized marijuana, medical marijuana, or I guess we could say legalized recreational use of marijuana. The results of that poll of 2,000 East Coast citizens will probably not be representative accurately of the larger population of the United States. That would be a biased sample. And so, while polls are a way to measure public opinion, you want to make sure you have a good cross-section of people, a good sampling to represent the country. And then how do you decrease your margin of error? Well, I think we saw in one of the videos Wednesday, and for those of you who couldn't understand it, the smaller sample size you have, that is, the smaller number of people that you include in your poll, will have a larger margin of error. The more people you can poll, the more accurate your margin of error will be. And that margin of error is where we say something like, you'll hear a news organization say, the most recent poll said 53% of Americans want to build a wall on the border. That's just throwing that out there. And a lot of times you can see in small print the margin of error. It'll say something like 3% or 4% or 5%, which means, for example, if it was a 3% margin of error, when they say that 53% of Americans favor a wall and it's got a 3% margin of error, that means it's really between 50% to 56%. 3 3% either way from 53. So you want to have a smaller margin of error to have more accurate results, and that means you have a larger sample of people to do your poll. If I was to give you as my American government class at Carr Albert for the fall of 2019 with 20 students, if I was to give you a poll, that would have a larger margin of error, because you would not be an accurate representation of the American citizens. And then another factor is, what is best in a poll is you have a random sample. And this will be on the bottom of page 161 in your textbook. And this is where a poll, for example, a poll that is conducted over the phone, and they randomly call phone numbers in hopes that they will get a more diverse representation for the poll. Again, using our East Coast analogy, if the Oklahomans, let's just say an organization like the Oklahomans Against Abortion, if they were to do a phone sample and all they did was call 2,000 people on the East Coast, that's not going to be a good sampling. It's not going to be random. It's going to be very targeted to people who live on the East Coast, who probably favor abortion rights more than your average Oklahoman. And so randomness is important in polls. So politicians, organizations, news outlets, they measure public opinion with polls. And so that's a very important aspect. A couple of political cartoons here. The poll, the one conducting the poll here, going door to door, runs into a man who says, "Put me down for whoever comes out ahead in your poll." Then another one here, you have a voter in the voting booth, comes out and says to the pollster, "I forget, who did you say I wanted to vote for?" Now, that could be another factor in your polls. Example, if you have a random poll in which people are calling people, the pollsters could exercise bias very easily and try to influence the people they're talking to. We had a family member who received a phone call, and it wasn't about politics, but it was about their TV viewing habits. And our relative said that they tend to watch family-friendly shows, and they don't watch R-rated things generally, and they avoid shows that have a lot of sexual innuendo and profanity and things like that. And the woman who had called said something to the effect to our relative, "Well, you're kind of the problem in our country." And so that pollster was clearly biased. Uh-oh, got a blank there. How'd that happen? see if we can get rid of that blank. There we go. So when they conduct a poll, there are some dimensions about public opinion that pollsters and groups need to keep in mind. The first one here is direction. And you will want to know these three things. Probably for the first quiz of this next module and the test. But direction. And this refers to whether or not a person has a clear, well, let's use the phrase pro or con. Pros are the things that you would have for it. Cons are the things you'd have against it. So the direction dimension refers to a person's preference with respect to a particular issue. Do they have a con position or do they have a pro position? And so the issue of abortion, you have really two diametrically opposed sides. You have pro-life, those that are absolutely for the outlawing of abortion. And then you have pro-choice, those that are absolutely for what they would say a woman's right to choose. So the direction of the people who are polled. There is in your textbook on page 163 a reference to a poll in 2014 by the Washington Post and ABC News, and they asked the people whether undocumented immigrants living in the United States should or should not be given the right to live and work here legally. 50% of those who responded said they should be allowed to live and work here legally, having never gone through the immigration process, while 46% said no. They need to become legal citizens the proper way, and then they can work here and live here. So what is the direction, which means an individual's preference concerning a particular issue? The next dimension is salience. And this simply means how important do people consider an issue? And that would be compared to other issues. Do people believe, for example, that President Trump releasing his tax forms, do they believe that's important? Is it salient to how people look upon their involvement in the government process, whether or not they vote, whether they're going to get involved in the 2020 election? Do they believe that whether or not Trump releases those tax forms is salient or not? And then related to salience is intensity. The strength with which a particular belief or opinion is held? Do people feel strongly about certain issues? Usually it's related to salience, because if they feel strongly, then they attach a lot of importance to it. If people believe that, if they feel strongly that every president should release their tax forms, then that will be a salient dimension to them, very important. They would probably, if they live in California, they will probably vote for the measure that the California State Board is trying to pass for the 2020 election. They are trying to get past that only candidates who have released their tax forms can be on the California ballot. So if you were a California resident who believed that it was very important, that is, and you had a strong opinion on that, you would probably vote for that measure. So in measuring public opinion, those three dimensions are important. So now we're going to move on to political socialization. We're moving on from public opinion to political socialization. But first, let me just go back and review that public opinion is just basically the views that people have, their political opinions that ordinary citizens have, that they tend to openly express. And those who run for office, those who report news, some of those other organizations that Craig talked about, a think tank, they depend upon polls to measure public opinion. And some of the dimensions used to measure their public opinion: direction, salience, and intensity. What is political socialization? It's kind of answers the question, why do I think the way I think? Political socialization is the process of shaping one's ideas and attitudes about government. So it's a process, and it deals with how one's ideas and attitudes about government have been shaped and are continuing to be shaped, if that's true. Some people, they haven't changed their political attitudes pretty much ever. So let's put this all in one. There we go. So political socialization happens early in our lives, and there are many factors or agents that are contributors to our political socialization. And it begins, of course, early in life, and the primary agents for socializing people politically are family. This is the number one. Sorry, I got distracted there. Family is the number one agent for influencing our political socialization. And then school, these are other primary factors or agents. Family being the most influential, and then school and then church. These are the primary factors or agents, in the socialization of citizens' politics, political socialization. Secondary agents include our peers, that is our friends and classmates who we go to school with. The media is a strong agent today in how people are influenced politically. Other leaders outside of the school or the church or the family are a secondary influence, such as political leaders. Maybe the Hollywood crowd are people that citizens look up to as leaders, and they get input from them. And then we could add events that influence the political socialization of citizens. Events like 9/11, and other major events that occur. Recently, the mass shootings, the gun shootings in Texas, California. These kind of events can be an agent on the political socialization of a citizen. And then the individual takes in all these inputs, and then they have outputs in their lives. They have knowledge, skills, behaviors, and values. And that results in who we vote for, or what we vote for, our political opinions, our political behaviors. So moving on now from political socialization. And well, before we do, just think about your own life. Think about your own political views, and just look at these agents here. And I'm sure for most of you, it was true that your family was the primary factor in who you are today as a political citizen. So let's move on to the third main section of the chapter. And we're going to look at 3 frames of reference that Americans use to think politically. Number 1 is party identification. Do people as they grow older, as they grow up and then grow older, do they tend to have a loyalty to a political party? And the answer would be yes. Most Americans identify with a political party, and for many of them, the identification is tied into what their parents believed. So party identification, and there's obviously more than Republicans and Democrats and independents. Political ideology. This would be your distinction of liberal versus conservative. The alt-right versus the liberal left. We could also put in there if you are an economic liberal or an economic conservative. Oh, excuse me, I keep yawning. I'm sorry. Cultural liberals versus cultural conservatives. There's also others who might consider themselves a socialist or libertarian. So one's political ideology, how they, basically the way they the lens in which they view issues. Now, we would tend to think that liberal and conservative would line up with Democrat and Republicans, Democrats being liberal, Republicans being conservative, but that's not all the way across the board. There can be conservative Democrats and there can be liberal Republicans. So political ideology. And a good example is on page 175 and 176 of your textbook. Talking about the area of economics. Economic liberals would be Americans who believe that the government should use its power to help people who are economically disadvantaged. So an economic liberal would say the government should help those that are economically disadvantaged. Economic conservatives would believe that the government should stay out of the economy and leave it up to a free market. So political ideology is a frame of reference by which we look at politics. Another little cartoon there, the left and the right. You first, as far as meeting in the middle. A third frame of reference we would call group orientations. And so this is where we see politics through a lens of a particular relation or affinity to a group. So people may see political issues through the lens of gender, sexual orientation, region. Does the Northeast look at things differently than the Midwest? disability, ethnicity, the age and generation of a group of people. Do senior adults, and we would say, yes, senior adults look at Social Security differently than teenagers and people in their early 20s. Occupation, educational level, these are all groups that we can be a part of that affect the way we view the political landscape. Next, we want to talk about the final section, the influence of public opinion on policy. How much influence does public opinion have on policy? Well, if public opinion had complete influence on public policy, we would not be a constitutional republic. We would be a straight democracy, which, if you recall, our founding fathers, they were afraid of democracy. They looked at it as a route to mobocracy. And so public opinion does not have outright influence on our government as far as controlling it. There are limits to the influence of public opinion. Some of those limits are a population that is, what I would say, their knowledge about political things is a general knowledge, not a specific knowledge. So they might want lower taxes, for example, which I would think most Americans are for lower taxes. That's a pretty general, that would be a very general policy issue. But specifically, how would Americans want our government to cut taxes? What are some of the specific steps that they could take so that our taxes could be lower? And most Americans would not have a plan for that. They would not have a specific idea about how to implement the general concern of lower taxes. So public policy could be helpful in knowing just some of the general feelings and attitudes of the people, but it could not be used to help our leaders in specific policy legislation. So the better off you are as far as being well-informed is, see, the more well-informed you are, the better off you would be as a citizen. Not only knowing about the issues, but do you understand the issues? This is another area that can limit the influence of public opinion. People can also be up and down, as this little cartoon illustrates. And so that would have an effect on the influence of public opinion on policy. If the people are up and down and kind of wishy-washy, that will not be helpful to our lawmakers and leaders in the government. Another thing that would and does affect the influence of public opinion is that there are boundaries. There are boundaries that have been put in place that do stop public opinion from maybe shaping a certain area or completely changing it. For example, during his administration, George W. Bush wanting to make it an option to where people could privatize their Social Security. And this received a lot of backlash, especially from senior adults, senior citizens who had put so much into their Social Security. And while younger generations of Americans embraced it and were okay with it, and that may have been enough for Bush and his team, his cabinet, to think, okay, let's move forward on this. There were some boundaries put in there, and this is referenced on page 182, and it was by FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was the one who brought Social Security into America through his program, the New Deal. Roosevelt basically put a boundary in, not so much an official boundary, but he knew that public opinion would work to preserve Social Security just the way it was. So no politician would be able to touch or even get rid of FDR's Social Security program. So if Bush and his pollsters felt like there were enough Americans to, whose opinion was, let's privatize Social Security, there had already been decades of public opinion and still a generation of older folks who were looking forward to their Social Security who would say, no, it cannot be touched. So that would have been a boundary on the influence of a younger generation who was going to go along with Bush's proposal for Social Security. So as we summarize this chapter and close up this session, public opinion is something that is important to our politicians and our leaders, but public opinion is not an exact science. While we do understand the agents that influence people in their public opinion and their political socialization, agents like family and their friends and their schools and churches and the media, and they shape individuals to be the political citizens that they are. People can change their political parties. People can change their ideologies in some areas. And that's another factor that makes polling not 100% reliable. And so while leaders cannot completely go by public opinion, nor can they control it, they can study all these factors and maybe get a better understanding to how it works and what's working so that they can have more accurate polls, more accurate surveys, and get a more accurate feel for what the American people believe and what their attitudes are towards those things. So if you have any questions on Chapter 6, save them for Monday. I'll put these slides up. They'll be up tomorrow when you watch this video. So if you have any questions, let me know. And have a great weekend, and we will see you Monday morning. Oh, one more thing. I will not have all the tests finished by tonight, which I said would be done by Thursday night. So some of you will get your grade tomorrow. So other than that, we'll see you on Monday, and we'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.